On April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The fourth power generation unit building was partially destroyed and a fire occurred and nuclear radiation leaked out of the nuclear reactor. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was one of the largest nuclear power plants. This station was built 20 kilometers from the city of Chernobyl. Hence the name Chernobyl Station. A small town for workers and employees was built near the reactor called Pripyat. Before the explosion, 50,000 people lived there.
The explosion at the Chernobyl reactor happened for several reasons. The first is that the reactor was not equipped with modern protection systems and the level of control over the processes taking place in the reactor was weak. On that fateful night, specialists were conducting an experiment on the change in the inertial turbine rotation speed in the event of a sudden power outage. Can the turbines supply the water pumps with electric power after a power failure for 40 seconds until the backup diesel generators start working? The experiment was conducted at a level of less than the required level, specifically at 200 megawatts instead of 700 megawatts. It is known to nuclear energy specialists that the reactor at this level of energy becomes difficult to control, and it was necessary to stop the reactor by lowering the control rods to the zero level. The control rods are inserted from the top, in the depth of the reactor, and the more they go down, the lower the intensity of the reaction, and thus the lower the heat generated. That is, it is used to control the temperature of water and steam in the reactor by moving it down, to lower the temperature, and up to raise the temperature inside the reactor. Here, the responsible engineer ordered to raise the control rods, the brakes for the reaction, to the highest point, and at the same time, the backup cooling water cycle was stopped. That role was used in emergency situations. The temperature began to rise, and with it the evaporation of water in the reactor increased, which led to a rise in pressure. Here, the operator pressed the emergency button to lower the control rods to curb the reaction process and reduce it, thus lowering the temperature of the water and steam. However, the control bars went down to the 25% level and stopped going down. The investigators later stated that the reason for this was the deformation and deviation of the channels of the control rods due to the high temperature. Here, the tools to influence the increasing rise in temperature and pressure are over, and in moments, 2 explosions occurred that destroyed the nuclear electric power plant.
After the explosion, a huge fire appeared. The firefighting began by the station employees and firefighters, who received the highest levels of radiation, which led to the death of 27 of them during the 3 months after the explosion. After the fire was extinguished, the helicopter crew sprinkled special sand to reduce radioactive emission and to put out the fire completely. Note that the burning nuclear materials generated very high heat, which increased the specialists' fears of melting the reactor floor and leaking these radioactive materials into the water that was below the reactor, and thus the possibility of a new interaction with the water and the generation of high heat again and another explosion. In addition, for fear of the radioactive materials reaching the water in the soil below the reactor, a tunnel was dug and concrete was poured under the tunnel as a support pillow to prevent the leakage of these radioactive materials into the soil water below the reactor. Nuclear radiation spread to Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, and then to Europe, and 3 days after the explosion, specialists in Sweden noticed a high level of radiation, and the search for the source began. Only then the Soviet Union announced that there had been an explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant located in Ukraine. Soviet at that time. After that, the affected cities and areas were evacuated. 30 years after the date of the explosion, they are still unfit for life, and housing there is prohibited. The charges were brought against 6 persons, the director of the nuclear plant, the responsible engineer and his deputy, the shift manager, the reactor unit official, and the general controller of nuclear energy.
One of the people who tried to defend themselves the most was the deputy engineer in charge, Anatoly Dyatlov, who was supervising the implementation of the experiment and focused in his defense that the design of the reactor in the first place was wrong and the designers did not take into account the required safety and security aspects. He also stated that the reactor exploded during the operation of the safety system, which was supposed to provide protection and prevent the explosion.
However, the prosecution committee stated that what the engineers had done during the experiment was wrong and that the nuclear reactor was safe if it was used correctly, as they said. As a result, the director of the nuclear plant, the responsible engineer and his deputy were sentenced to 10 years in prison, and the rest from 2 to 5 years. In fact, everyone was released from prison after serving half of their sentence. The workers in the reactor and firefighters were most affected by the radiation, and their treatment was followed up in Moscow in Specialized Hospital No. 6. All the victims were completely covered with concrete to prevent radiation from their bodies. According to the World Health Organization, the victims of the explosion reached 4,000, and according to other sources, the number of victims reached tens of thousands and even 100,000. And this topic remained a point of controversy.
Around the reactor, tens of thousands of kilometers of radioactive lands and crops became unfit for agriculture and life.
Pripyat, which was built in the 60s for workers and employees in the reactor, was a civilized city with all amenities, entertainment and services. Officials tried to hide the fact of the explosion from the population there, who number 50,000, knowing that the nuclear radiation in this city near the reactor reached 1,000 times the permissible. After that, this city and the surrounding areas of the reactor were evacuated with a radius of 30 kilometers, and it was approved as a population-free area. The total that was evacuated from the vicinity of the nuclear station reached 115,000. At the present time, it is forbidden to visit these areas, with the exception of the relatives of the victims to visit the graves and tourists from all over the world who wish to see the results of this disaster. And there are those who remained in the vicinity of the afflicted area on their responsibility, and most of them are elderly and disabled. The stricken plant was covered with a thick cover designed to serve 100 years. The Chernobyl explosion once again reminded people of the danger. Goodbye and best regards.